Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. We are starting to enter one of my favorite times of year to fish, kind of regardless where you're at in the country. We lost our ice now, so we got fish that are starting to move up on bed. You got fish that are in post spawn pretty much throughout the rest of the country. So from that standpoint, we are entering topwater season. Topwater time is one of my favorite times of the year to fish. Generally, you're talking about from the spawn into the summer months and even into the fall. But once that water temperature hits like the 60-degree mark, maybe 65-degree mark, topwater bite can really turn on. And it's one of the best ways to generate a big strike as well. You know, really what you're talking about is the bass are in shallow right now this time of year to do their spawning process. And anytime you're talking about bass that are up shallow, a topwater is a great choice because there's just not that much water depth between the fish and where your bait is, meaning there's less distance for those fish to have to travel to get your bait. And if you're talking about the spawn period, whether it's pre-spawn, spawn, or post-spawn, you have a lot of the largemouth population, a lot of the bass population up shallow. And topwaters are a great thing. After they're done spawning, a lot of those population will guard fry. One of the best ways to trigger a fry guarding bass is to bring a topwater around the fry. The bass hate that. They'll eat it. After they're done guarding fry, you talk about a shad spawn, a lot of times a bluegill spawn. And from that standpoint as well, not too many baits mimic either of those forage species for bass better than a topwater bait. And the reality is, a topwater is a great way at generating big bites, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the bass don't get a good look at it. What they know is they see something making commotion on the surface, which in most cases is probably imitating a dying forage species for them, whether that's a dying shad, a dying bluegill, maybe a baby bird, maybe it's a chipmunk swimming across the water. It all happens, and all of that provides a good opportunity for a bass to feed. So regardless of what they think it is, they know there's something that's potentially a food source for them, and that's what draws their attention to it. But having said all of this, all topwaters are not the same. They're not interchangeable, in my opinion, with respect to where to throw them. Some work great in the same areas as others, but some don't work great in those same areas as well. So I want to go through these because I get a lot of questions from viewers wanting to know when to throw a specific topwater bait in a certain situation. So I wanted to go through all the different categories of topwaters and kind of give you a quick idea as to when and where I like to throw them. I think I've got 7 or 8 different types of categories here within the topwater genre. I do not have frogs because a frog to me, even though it's a topwater, is a completely separate subset of topwater type bait to throw. And we do lots of frog videos, so I'll cover that at another time. But these are all going to be your hard topwater baits, and we're just going to go through them. No particular order. These are some of my favorites within each category, and I'll put links for these to Tackle Warehouse if you want to help support the channel and use my affiliate links. That would be very much appreciated. But these are some of the ones that I throw on a regular basis. So let's kick this off. The first one we're going to talk about are our creeper style baits. These are walking style baits that are kind of its own category. This is a jackal pompadour. So in this case, these baits have wings. They're meant to be straight retrieve for the most part, and they just walk side to side. It almost looks like somebody doing a breaststroke as they swim on the surface to me. These baits are really good baits around isolated cover, in my opinion. So one of the negatives to them is you have to retrieve them at a pretty slow speed to get them to run right. And because it's a slow speed, you're talking about not covering a ton of water. And that's what makes this a good bait to throw specifically around cover. So what I mean by that is I wouldn't necessarily take this out on a big shallow flat where I'm making super long casts and just retrieving it back to the boat. I'm not going to cover enough water to make this the ideal choice. But if I'm fishing around a dock or fishing around a lay down tree or fishing around holes in a grass flat, something where I know I've got a specific keyed in zone, that is where I would like to throw this. So even though it's made to be straight retrieved for a long distance, it really works better, in my opinion, for only a small portion of your cast, maybe a quarter to a third of your cast, because you're fishing it around a specific target. They're really good at generating bites. They just are not great baits for covering a ton of water. Next category. Let's go with our wake baits. So this is a Berkley surge shad. So these are minnow style baits in the same form of a jerk bait. The key with these is they're made to be retrieved on the surface. So they basically create a good V coming along the surface, like you'd get from a dying shad or a bait fish that's just swimming at the surface. These baits excel right before the spawn. They really excel when the water temp, I'm gonna say, is like 55 to like low 60s. It works really good during the pre-spawn phase. So a lot of times if you're talking about fish that are starting to push back shallow into areas where they might spawn, but they're aggressively feeding up for the spawn, there are lots of times where a wake bait retrieved across the surface can be the absolute best topwater bait. You know, at that time period, there's not that many topwater baits that are going to be very good in terms of generating a lot of strikes, but there's something to a wake bait that really generates strikes during that kind of colder water period for topwaters. So if you live on a body of water that has smallmouth and spotted bass, this will drive them nuts during that period. It's one of the best topwaters to throw. Still catches largemouths as well, but it really shines for spotted bass and smallmouth in my opinion. Next up, we're gonna go with a walking bait. This is one of my absolute favorite walking baits. This is the Vixen by Reaction Innovations. These things have a pretty storied history and we know they work great. A walking bait, in my opinion, is one of the best baits at covering large expansive areas of water. So this is a bait that I would throw on big flats, whether that's a grass flat or a rocky flat, or maybe a flat full of sand holes and rock transitions if you're fishing in the North Country. But this is a great bait at covering water. It still is a good bait to work around cover as well if you've got some isolated pieces that you want to throw topwater by. But it really shines in just an expansive area where I can cover a ton of water. Does a really good job at being heavy enough to make super long casts. You can speed the retrieve up, you can slow it down, but you can do a lot of things to generate strikes without actually stopping the bait and letting it sit there. But in my opinion, a walking bait is an absolute must to have in your tackle box. But for me, it generally doesn't really start up until the middle of summer. I like to throw other topwaters earlier in the first part of the summer in the late spring. One of those is a prop style bait. This is the Berkley Spin Rocket. If you guys follow my channel, you probably saw me using it at Lake Okeechobee this year. This is a really good style of bait to throw when the fish are up on their beds or are in a pre-spawn phase or fry guarding phase. The reason for that is it's a bait that you twitch and let sit in place. So again, you're going to want to be throwing it around specific pieces of cover where you think the fish are going to be holding or making nests or guarding fry. And you're going to let this bait sit there. So you twitch it, let it sit, twitch it, let it sit. You're generally not going to be working this bait back to the boat much more than maybe a quarter of your cast. The key here is it's the tantalizing motion of it just sitting in the water that generates the strikes. And the little props in the back do a really good job at mimicking fry. So if you've seen fry and you scatter fry, maybe you make a cast to a fry ball, you'll see them kind of sputter along the surface a lot of times. The small blades on prop baits do an excellent job at creating that same sort of fry scattering motion and that sound, which allows the guarders, the fry guarding bass, to feel like their fry are being challenged or are being eaten. So from that standpoint, it gets them to be very aggressive. But to me, a prop bait really shines in two periods. Right around the spawn, like I just mentioned. The other would be if you've got bluegill beds that are up shallow later in the summer. A lot of times putting a prop style bait right on top of the bluegill beds is a great way to generate strikes from bass that are sitting off of that bluegill bed waiting for an injured bluegill or a bluegill to not recognize that the bass is there, and then the bass will take advantage. So if you've got a prop bait at the surface, a lot of times the bass thinks that bluegill is feeding, therefore the bass takes advantage of that and feeds on that bluegill. So that's when I like to throw prop baits. Outside of those 2 periods, I really don't throw prop baits that much. Next up, let's talk about the evergreen shower blower. So this bait is what I would consider a long distance casting bait. It's a big pencil popper style bait. The idea behind this and what separates really these 2 baits, which are both mainly just a straight walking bait, is that this thing is meant to be cast basically as far as you can cast a bait. The reason for it is it dominates around schooling fish. So if you live on a blueback herring lake or a lake where you get a lot of bass that push shad up to the surface, you want a bait that you're going to be able to make an extremely long cast with and then walk it back across the surface very, very quickly to get it to skitter and scatter, which gives it that look of a fleeing bait fish trying to get away from bass. In the summer months, like once the post-spawn period starts, I've always got something like this shower blower rigged up just for that 1 or 2 times throughout the day where you might see a big gizzard shad get chased, or the shad come up to the surface. I like to have it ready because generally it doesn't happen right next to the boat. Usually it's like 2 casts from the boat. Well, if you've got a bait like this that you can fire that far, it really gives you a better opportunity at getting in on those schooling fish. So this bait really kind of starts up, I'm going to say ledge season. So June-ish all the way up through the winter months for me. Next up, we're going to talk about a popper. This is a Rebel Popper, one of my favorites in the Tennessee shad color. A popper like this is an essential bait to have, in my opinion, when you're talking about topwater baits. This, to me, is like the best, what I call target topwater. Specifically, what I'm referring to is I throw this when I'm fishing specific pieces of cover. So maybe I've got a laid-down tree, maybe I've got a stump, a dock, a little hole in the weeds, anything where I feel like I think I know where the fish is at. That's when I like to pull this out, make a cast to that spot. I give it a couple of bloops. Maybe I work it a quarter of the way back to the boat max. I reel it up, cast to the next target. Again, this is similar to what I was saying before with that spin rocket. It's all about kind of tantalizing that fish into biting. So you pop it, you let it sit there for a little bit. Some people like the rings to completely disappear. Other people like to work it a little faster. The key is you let it sit there. You kind of give the fish an opportunity to look at it. There's not too many better baits that look like a bluegill that's feeding on the surface when it's sitting there in the water, and it just generates a lot of strikes. It's also a blast to fish. All of these are a blast to fish, but a popper to me is like one of the most iconic baits that you can throw when you think about bass fishing. And they've been around since the beginning of bass fishing, and it's because they catch a pile of fish. But a popper to me is very much a specific cast that I want to make. So, like I was saying, I may have a hole in the grass that's only that big. I'll put it in there, pop it twice, pull it out of that hole in the grass, throw it to the next hole in the grass. It's all about specific precision casts, and that bait will get bit if you're throwing it. Last up, we're going to talk about is our plopper style category. My favorite and go-to, the Chapo. This is the 105 size. It comes in a lot of different sizes, but this is similar to like a buzzbait, right? It's a cast straight retrieve. The blade is spinning, giving off a lot of commotion. One of the keys with this bait is it's all about covering water. You can cover, I'm going to say, more water with this bait than any other topwater. And it has to do more with the fact that you're straight retrieving it, meaning you cast it out, you're reeling it with the rod, with the reel handle. You're not doing a whole lot with the rod. You may impart a couple of twitches to break up that tail spinning, the commotion that it's making and giving it some erratic activity. But the reality is you're not going to get worn out because you're not twitching the bait continuously like you would with a walking bait. To me, this bait has taken over a lot of the same places where I would throw a buzz bait. If it's relatively clean water, meaning there's not much grass, there's not much floating debris, I'm going with a chopo rather than a buzz bait. I'll throw a buzz bait if I can't get this clean through that water, through whatever it is that I'm fishing. But this thing is one of the best baits at generating strikes. So again, though, for me, this comes into play more, I'm going to say, from the post-spawn period into the summer months and into the fall. I actually think it continues to get better as you get later into the fall. It just seems like right now you've still got a lot more of that, the fish that are still relating to the bedding areas. As the year progresses, you get a lot more fish that are relating to like points and just main lake shorelines where there might be some shad or some herring coming up. And from that standpoint, you can cover a ton of water with this bait. But that's kind of the breakdown. So these are 7 categories of topwaters. I feel like I've probably missed a couple, but there are very specific times and places to throw each one. Every topwater bait is not the same when it comes to just, hey, I'm going to throw a topwater. You want to choose wisely for the conditions and the areas that you're fishing. And if you do that, I think you're going to catch a few more fish with your topwater baits. So hopefully, guys, you found this helpful. If you did, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned. New video coming out tomorrow.